So, Declan Forde, welcome to New Ireland TV. You're a long-time person of Omagh, person of significance in and around Omagh and the art scene and the music scene and the spoken word scene. So, overall, what's your general impression of how Omagh is portrayed?
Omagh?
Yeah.
Well, firstly, James, I would describe myself as a retired teacher by occupation, a poet by inclination, and a pauper by circumstance. And yeah, I've got involved in that, the kind of spoken word through sessions. An old late friend of mine, a man called Owen Smith, had a cottage called Ferna Cottage, or Chack Owen. And, oh Lord, it was 30 years ago. He was renovating this old cottage, and as luck would have it, musicians came along and we started the sessions. And I got involved in the spoken word kind of through that, because I would recite poems, but they weren't poems that I was particularly fond of, but they were old James Young. Remember James Young, the Belfast comedian?
Our Jimmy.
Our Jimmy.
Yes,
and
yeah.
James Young, he would do poems like parodies of the works of Robert Service, the great Scottish poet. Danger Stan McGrew, like a bunch of the boys was whooping it up in a Malamute saloon. But James Young would do it, a bunch of the boys was whooping it up in a Sandy Row saloon, and make it into kind of provincial.
Right.
But I got fed up doing that, and I started to write my own, and that changed my life completely, And it is very much part of that tradition in Omagh. You have the spoken word through. Probably the best known would be the Reverend Marshall and Drumlister and Me and Me Da, poems like that, or Sarah Ann. And the strange thing is, Marshall wrote the poems when he was away from Tyrone.
Right.
He was almost harking back. And of course you have John Montague up by Gervahi, and Rose Kavanagh, Alice Milligan from Mountfield. And of course in the prose you have Ben Kelly. And he links in nicely with some of the areas we'll touch on. He was an uncle, of course, of Brian Call's.
Right, okay.
And like Brian Call, he was a great raconteur and a great storyteller, So I've kind of tapped into that, and I think in a way I've made it my own. I do my own poems and stories in my own peculiar way.
And you've been hosting an internet radio station recently, especially over the lockdown, called Sweet Omagh Town Radio, where you covered a lot of this, and you also covered a lot of the history of the music of the town, places like the Royal Arms and Derek Mahaffey, and just very recently there was the showband exhibition, which I believe you're involved in.
Just finished, yeah, and myself and Donald McGurgan have been interviewing people for this past 30 years, and over the lockdown, which seems like a lifetime ago, Donald took it upon himself to digitise what we had recorded and those we had recorded, and put them out then to Sweet Omagh Town, basically just to pass the time. And yeah, it's interesting, I enjoy talking to people, and we met some strange, interesting, wonderful characters, and who thought they had no stories to tell, but as you are discovering yourself, everybody has a story to tell. So that's how we got involved in that, and yeah, so it has been an adventure. There is a strong tradition of the showbands here now. The showbands, I think, they're a phenomenon that are peculiar to Ireland, of course, for about 15 years. The majority of the showbands were cover bands. Though bands like the Plattermen and the Freshmen, I think, did their own material and had that great creative input. But by and large, most of the show bands really were replicating the sounds that they had heard from the UK and the US, and they put their own, I suppose, stamp on it in a way with arrangements, but they were primarily for dancing. Dance the night away. And when you think of it, in the early days, the show bands, some of them were playing from 9 o'clock at night to 2 o'clock in the morning.
Right, yeah.
Which I don't think even Mr. Edward Sheeran could do.
No.
It was a different way, a different time, and Pete Seeger talked about it in another way. He talked about the folk tradition. In other words, that a song becomes a folk song, you forget who wrote it. I heard, for example, Tommy Makem, great singer from Omagh, used to sing a song called The Factory Girls, and I thought it was an old folk song from Milford in County Armagh. It was written by Roy Arbuckle up in Derry,
Right, okay.
a song called Distant Drums, but the way it was written, it was timeless, you know. So music kind of evolves. The show bands, they have their day, they'll come back, they are being flogged to death at times with concerts and that, where they were trying to revive the show bands, but you can't, they were at a certain moment in time.
Yeah, there were a time and a place.
That's exactly, as we all are. We all are at a time and a place, and that's it.
My mum and my dad were sort of big in the show band era, and they would talk about the Royal Arms Mews and the Royal Arms Hotel, which would invite some of the biggest names in pop music at the time, like Trogs and some of the other ones. So Omagh did have at one stage a very vibrant live music scene.
Oh, it did indeed, yeah. Like when I was growing up, I remember seeing Thin Lizzy.
Right, there you go. Yes,
in the Royal Arms, and sort of a few years prior to that, the likes of Engelbert Humperdinck, Tom Jones, who's now got a new lease of life in The Voice, playing for, I think it was the equivalent of 25p in to see him, Jim Reeves, of course, away 60 odd years ago, the American singers. And strange, how American singers began to come over here, and you would wonder, looking at it quite coldly, was that because their careers were not, going that well in America that they come over here to tap into an audience? But you think singers like Hank Lachlan, who died when he was in his 90s and he was still performing on the stage of the Grand Ole Opry, that they tapped into a kind of a market here. And Johnny Cash did, of course, with 40 Shades of Green.
Yes, yeah.
And I remember seeing him in Carrickmacross in the early 90s. And they began the intro to 40 Shades of Green, and somebody shouts up, that was a folk song. He says, "No, I wrote that song in 1956 or whatever, Yeah, so, and I suppose it is a kind of, what would you say, it would be a compliment to the songwriter if the song becomes everybody's, and sort of passed on.
And it just enters into the sort of common lexicon.
Well, so that's it, yeah, the folk process is, as Pete Seeger would say,
Yeah, and just you mentioned Johnny Cash there. Myself and yourself go back. You were my art teacher way back in the Brothers at the time, and actually I remember you played the Johnny Cash song "Hurt," and I think it was actually the week he had passed, because he only released the video about 3 or 4 days before. So. So what was your general memories of the Brothers and the
I loved it.
And teaching?
I loved teaching. I loved the Brothers. I loved it. It was very enjoyable, and it was of its time. It was it's like all things must pass. All things change. You move on, and I enjoyed every minute of it. Do I miss it? Not really. I don't miss the day to day. Like you ask anybody who retires, do you miss work? No, you can't yourself on. Get a life.
Yeah.
But I miss the interaction with the young fellas and the colleagues. I miss that side of it, and that was enjoyable, and I was very lucky to work with a bunch of people that were good friends, and it was very enjoyable. And my youngest daughter is teaching now in London, and I think she seems to have inherited that kind of joy and pleasure out of teaching that I was lucky to have,
Well, just another thing that I remember from one of your classes was that it was the week before Easter on 1998, and the Good Friday Agreement was being negotiated. Of course, we didn't know it was going to be a Good Friday Agreement at the time, because they kept pushing it back.
That's right.
But can you remember any differences between then and now?
Of course I have. I mean, this place was miserable during the Troubles. It was horrible place to live, in the sense that there were all these outside agencies that threatened normality. And we come back to a kind of a normality. We will find it, and if people would just actually sit down and maybe listen to songs a bit more, listen to music a bit more. Shakespeare put it well in Twelfth Night. He says, "If music be the food of love, play on," and he was right. It is immeasurably much better than it was, and anybody who says it's not really is not looking around them.
Indeed,
And I know it was a strange time, you know. It was almost like we were stuck in aspic, you know. Nothing moved, nothing progressed, you know. And hopefully now, with each new generation, you can put the sins and the crimes and the thoughts of the past in the past where they belong, because you don't, you know, looking into the past doesn't point to a future, you know.
Yeah,
you know,
indeed,
and so, but I think we are much better off now than we were, certainly, than in those dark days, you know, prior to the Good Friday Agreement,
yep.
you know.
And you were mentioning there, you had an event with Michael Moloney, is that his?
Mike Moloney.
Mick Moloney.
Yeah.
So if you want to just describe who he was.
Mick Moloney, well, as somebody once said about another person, he was too clever by 3/4. You know, he was a marvellous man, a genius in his own way. He was a great banjo player, probably one of the best banjo players in the world. In his earlier days, he played with the Johnsons, the folk group, and as he said to me once, we were the ABBA of our day. You know, their harmonies were incredible. And he went into academia in the early 70s and lectured in a number of universities, but his last teaching post was New York University. And he kind of commuted between Bangkok and Thailand, where he was very heavily involved with an orphanage called the Mercy Centre, run by an extraordinary priest called Father Joe Mayer, who would be what you would call a force of nature. And Joe set up an orphanage and schools to look after the street kids in the worst slum in Bangkok, in Klong Doi, in the slaughterhouse region. And so much so that now when a child is found in the streets, the police will automatically contact Father Joe,
Right, okay.
you know, because he is the go-to for saving kids. And his mantra is go to school, go to school, go to school, get the kids an education, take them off the streets, you know. And I've been over, we've put on a few concerts here, we raised money. And I brought it over and it was an eye-opener, you know, to see the poverty and the inequity and the inequalities in Bangkok. And Mick was very heavily involved in that. I was over with him in the Catskills in July, and we last spoke about 2 days before he died, and he died very, very suddenly. In fact, he died on the 27th of July and was buried on the 29th of September. And there's going to be a wake in his memory in the University of Limerick in early November, so I'll be down at that. You know.
Yeah.
And he was very encouraging to me. He took me over to the States on a number of occasions, to West Virginia to teach, and from that then went up to Oregon and was with them then, as I say, at the Catskills Irish Festival. I was teaching about Irish art and Irish poetry and storytelling. And I did a book of, I do a Christmas poem every year.
Right, yeah.
And I have a kind of a certain way of kind of dealing with it. I do the illustrations as well as the poems, and I get them printed in black and white, and then I hand colour about 100.
Excellent.
Now, if I really like you, you'll get the hand coloured one, and I wish you a happy Christmas.
Right.
If I like you, but not that much, you'll get the black and white version that I couldn't be bothered painting, and I wish you a happy Christmas. And if I really don't like you, you'll get an ordinary Christmas card, wishing you a happy Christmas. But anyway, Mick did the intro. I put them out in a book. You know, you can see the illustrations. It's kind of based loosely in the old Cooler press that the Yeats has set up in the early part of the 20th century. And I would do poems for each, or sometimes songs, and you know, just sometimes like a thought would come into my head, you know, and this year's one actually is in memory of Mick, you know. I was overseeing my daughter in London a few years ago, and she took us to a session in Connolly's in Chiswick, where they have traditional music, and there was a guy from Cork who looked like Willie Nelson's younger brother, long grey hair and a beard, and he hadn't lost the Cork accent. He told me he'd been in London 40 years, and he makes his money by going from pub to pub singing as part of sessions, and he talked about Cork and leaving Cork and just what his life in London was like. You know, it was quite interesting, but I couldn't get it out of my head when I went home. So I came up with a poem. I kind of changed it from Cork to Tyrone.
Right, okay.
You know, it's just called Christmas in Chiswick. When the boys got together, McGillian took the lead, rattling out his repertoire of polkas, jigs and reels. And once the last post was sounded for the raucous throng, he packed away his fiddle to catch the night bus home. As the red double-decker sneaked through empty streets, lulled by its shudders, McGillian fell asleep to dream about another world, far from alien corn, to a little low cottage at the foot of Mullingar. Vermeer could have captured that simple kitchen scene, a bowl, gulp and buttermilk into an oatmeal skein, for his mother's daily miracle as her flower-freckled wrists shaped the bread of life with each pummel, turn and twist. The bus slunk to a halt, and McGillian, back to life, gathered up his fiddle case and stepped into the night. As he scurried through the alleyways, he glimpsed a Christmas sky and said a prayer for Mullingar, a teardrop in his eye. There you go.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Well, this year's poem is a memory of Mick. So I have a printed poem written, the illustration done, and I start hand colouring them now in another week or so.
Fantastic. Yeah.
And and I mean I was talking about Street Omagh Town. You know, it kept me and Donald McGurgan busy, and equally I got a phone call from Michael Moloney. He was in Bangkok. Locked down because of COVID, and he said I'm been commissioned by the Irish Arts Centre in New York to do a series of songs and music, and he said, would you do an illustration for me? It was a song called, I think, Joseph Baker, an English folk song. So we did that, and then it sparked something in Mick's head, and he says would you do me another 29 illustrations? He had picked out a number of songs, and I did the illustrations for the start. It was called By Memory Inspired. You'll get it on YouTube. And I did the illustration for the opening sequence and then for the closing sequence. And I mean, he had some great programs. He did it was almost like a mini documentary on Barney McKenna from the Dubliners.
Right, okay, yeah.
He did one based on a song called Has Anyone Seen Kelly? And he linked it into the story of the Kellys of Philadelphia, of Grace Kelly, the daughter of that family, was probably the best known. But a great fun doing that illustration because I populated the drawing with every conceivable Kelly. I think we had Luke Kelly playing the banjo on the street in New York, Gene Kelly hanging from a lamppost, Machine Gun Kelly, Ned Kelly even from Australia. You know, that was cracking fun. And but it just did old songs and old tunes. And the marvellous thing is, he was in Bangkok, I was in Omagh. Some of the musicians were in New York, some of them were in Dublin, and some were in Italy.
Right. And
by the wonders of modern technology, they were linked together by a great photographer called Roy Esmond, who provided photographs 60 years ago for Spotlight magazine. We were talking about the showbands. He would have taken photographs of the singers there. And that was made into two series. And from music to song to the spoken word, you know, it was great crack. And it gave something to do over COVID. I love the Tyrone accent. I do. There's something special about it. You know, Tyrone is the only place in the world where a dog can be wild tame.
Wild tame, yeah.
It makes sense to me and you, but to the outside world, no. And
would you like a cup of tea in your hand?
Oh, that's right. You know, my late friend Paddy Grugan, my late colleague, was a great man for taking the hand out of you. You know, there's another Tyrone expression. Yes. And I remember he said to me, I said to him once, Paddy, what's yourself and Kathleen, as his wife, doing at Easter? And he pulled himself up to his 6'2" and says, me and her's going to Paris. And what he was doing was imitating the accent of Lena. And for the benefit of anybody out there who doesn't know where Lena is, if you start off in Mountfield and you head towards Gorchin, when you're about halfway, you're in Lena. Right. And it's the strangest wee place. It's a townland. And a townland is what you know, what did Seamus Heaney say about the townland? Every stony acre has its story. In Lana they have this wonderful accent. They speak like that. They kind of duck the words out. And it's just, you go from, you cross from one side of the road to the other and ducks and like that's just see. And that's what Paddy Grugan was imitating.
Right.
The Lana accent. It's very strange, and it's only within a few fields. I was working in Dungannon for a while, and the accent in East Tyrone is different.
Yeah, and then you go to Strabane.
Completely
different accent again.
That's right. And then up to Castleberg, and then your way down to Fermanagh, where my mother was from. How you doing? And everybody thought, no. But anyway, I couldn't get that Paddy's me and her's going to Paris out of my head. So I thought me and her. It's a poem from Tyrone.
Lovely.
The night I catched her in Gortin, her eyes were twinkling like stars. Or I catched her, Sylvain, she told me. Well, we stepped out, me and her. Me and her got married in Mountful of a Monday in the middle of May, with a wedding breakfast in Carman, and we went to Omagh for the day. I had nothing to give her but hardship, on my father's farm to share, but she gave me 2 sons and a daughter, with a smile, the spit of her. Betimes I never liked her, though I loved her in my own twisted way. Many's the time her nyamming and her chittering drove me astray. But there was a time me and her laughed together, and we danced to an old fiddle tune. We lay snug together in her wee settled bed, and we threshed by the light of the moon. Her white hair is as soft as the daisies, and her skin's cracked like broken eggshell. Her beads are crocheted through her fingers, and there's nobody here but ourselves. For she's lying on a bolster of satin, and in her heart there's no longer a stir. And I howl I'm afeard of the murder, for that's the end of me and her.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And then there was a few wee Tyrone words in there.
Absolutely. I mean, could you imagine the difficult? How do you spell Nyaman?
Nyaman was the one I was thinking of.
Difficult. Ronnie Drew, the late Ronnie Drew, who has connections to Tyrone. Ronnie's wife was from Carrickmore.
Right, yes, okay.
Ronnie Drew, he says, you might as well sing sorrow as cry it. And he was right.
Yeah.
And what did Chesterton say? He says, all their wars were merry and all their songs were sad. So, that's, I suppose that's keeping the vernacular tradition alive,
And
yeah.
Well, I was going to say, do you find that the colloquialisms are sort of been not wiped out or anything, but they're just sort of been taken away just by the formalities of grammar and
education destroyed a lot of it.
Yeah.
And when I think of that kind of the pronunciation that was expected radically changed, I think, in the 60s when the Beatles came along, because the Beatles were very much they were Liverpudlian. They didn't change their accents and their voices, and suddenly it became acceptable to have your own accent, and to be proud of that. But prior to that, I think it was assumed that if you spoke properly the Queen's English or the King's English, that you were clever and that you could be easily understood. For example, I had an uncle. He was born in Omagh, and he lived abroad for most of his life. But when he came back here to speak, you would be hard pressed to see or to hear any Omagh accent in his, and the work that he did. He had this anonymous, accentless, accent or way of speaking. Kind of maybe it was a survival mechanism.
Yeah. Well, just even when I went over to England for the first time, like I had to make myself very aware that I speak very fast, as we all do from around here.
Absolutely.
I say it's because we think fast, but
because we don't think what's coming out.
Possibly.
Yeah, I remember the first time I went to America. There was a young lady picked myself and a banjo player called Olive Brennan up from Monaghan. We were in Pittsburgh. She was driving us down to West Virginia, and I was sitting in the front seat with her. And we were driving along, and I was speaking, and she wasn't responding.
Right.
And I started to think, if I said something offensive, and eventually I said, "Have I offended you by something I have said?" And she says, "No, I'm trying to process what you're saying." I was speaking too fast.
Yes,
I realised I had to slow down.
Indeed, yeah. And that was somebody with English as a first language. So
Absolutely, and again, I mean, I remember, being a student in Belfast, and with the Tyrone accent, you're almost like a rarity. And one of these guys from Belfast who had, I remember, it was very strange, James. I remember being in a class with a couple of guys from Belfast, and they had never seen a cow.
Right.
They had never seen green fields.
Right.
Their life was, it was like a living L.S. Lowry painting. Their life was within about 3 streets.
Yes.
The school, the shop, granny, granda, and uncles, aunts, cousins, all within the 2 or 3 streets.
And the day out to be into the city centre.
That was it, most peculiar, I wonder what is it about accent, I mean, I remember, I went over to see my brother in London and called into a pub, and there was a guy from Cavan, and I sat and had a couple of drinks with him, and he was very tearful. He hadn't lost the Cavan accent.
Right, yeah.
And he missed Cavan. But he had never been home. He'd been in London for over 30 years.
Right, yeah.
And his wife came down, she was English. And she just berated him and chased him out of the pub, And there he was living in a kind of, I suppose, a no man's land. I remember talking to a man once who had spent a lifetime in England, and he'd come back to the Midlands. And he was the saddest individual I ever met, because he said he lived a lifetime in London and he decided to come home. And he said he knew nobody at home.
Aye.
And then equally he says he couldn't go back to London because that world had changed as well.
Yeah.
So he was stuck.
Sort of in between.
Yeah, in between, the first poem or story that I wrote in that kind of tradition, the vernacular, was about that man from Cavan. But as you know, all things come back to Tyrone.
Well, this is
the centre of the universe.
Indeed.
And so there's a wee story, and a wee song at the end of it.
Yeah.
The song goes, one of these days, James, you're going to win the lottery. You're going to win the lottery, and you'll go with your cheque for 100 million in one hand and your letter of resignation in the other, and you'll tell your boss where he can put his job. Maybe one of these days, if you're far from home, if you're in Philadelphia or now in Australia or in England generations ago, maybe one of these days you'll go back home again. The old man sat in the corner, a stranger ignored on his own. So I bought him a drink and we chatted about this and that and home. His voice was almost a whisper, and his eyes were misty with tears, as he told me his lonely story and his life over 80 odd years. Says he, times were hard in the 30s, but times were harder at home, so I boarded the boat to England and I left the county Tyrone. The night I landed in Liverpool, a cardboard suitcase under my arm, so the smoke and the smell of the dockside made me long for me butt of a farm. A labouring man is all that I am, like Alpine Fusilier, so I gritted me teeth and I worked the sights, and I planned to go home in a year. When I got settled into me lodgings, I wrote to the one still at home, with big talk and lies, sir. I tried to disguise me lonely despair for Tyrone. I wanted to marry Bridget. I courted through letters to home, I'd send her the fare, look. She wouldn't dare to leave her mother alone. Well, if she wasn't going to marry, then by God I'd show them at home a big man like me. I didn't need her. I was too proud to go back to Tyrone. The letters from home got fewer, though I sent them a card every year. Should have 60 English Christmas cards for 60 English years. And last year, the post brought me nothing. So that's the end of me ties to home. So what on earth would I go back to? To a graveyard in County Tyrone? Me kith and kin's dead and buried, and I'm dying in lodgings alone. But it was heartening to hear your friendly brogue. Sure, it brought me memories back home. The old man stopped, and with his sleeve he gently wiped away a tear. We said goodbye, and as he shuffled out, he whispered in my ear, do us a favour when you go back. Walk down me lane in Tyrone and tell the fields this old man loves them and regrets that he ever left home. One of these days I'll sail away and pack all my dreams in my old cardboard case. I'll build me a boat with my hopes and my wishes. We'll sail together one of these days. One of these days I'll build me a tower, and I'll climb so high that I'll touch the sky. I'll hide in that tower for hours and hours, maybe even forever, one of these days. One of these days when my journey is over, I'll stake a claim on some golden shore. I'll find peace and contentment, sweet milk and honey. One of these days I'll be home once more. One of these days I'll sail away and pack all my dreams in my old cardboard case. I'll build me a boat with my hopes and my wishes. We'll sail together one of these days. We'll all sail together one of these days.
There you go. Fantastic, yeah. Brilliant.
Anyway, a little bit of misery.
Indeed, yeah, indeed. As you say, it has to put it into song.
Oh, so that's it.
It reminded me, well, number one, reminded me of a few Christy Moore songs. That theme of Irish people going to England and then sort of just getting into a routine and getting into a sort of lifestyle, and then, as you say, try to be the, you expect to come back as sort of the hero or the one that's made his millions. And as I suppose happened to the ones that went to the United States as well.
Oh yeah, but you will hear stories of the returned Yank.
Yeah.
And there's a sort of the awful thing about this country. It's a wonderful country, but there's a sort of a great begrudgery, and there's also that of who do you think you are?
Yeah, your notions.
You get above your station, which I think is an awful indictment of a kind of a hidden culture here, of whereas the Americans perhaps have gone over them. This is generalising. Maybe have gone over the top with positivity. They can do. I can do. Here you can't.
Yeah.
And there is that, and that how awful, for example, that people are judged by their grandparents or their great grandparents or their great grandparents. That you did this. some 1880s or 1890s, and it's still, that still hangs over people. And that's the only, I think, negative side to this place.
Your first question you're often asked is, you know, and which Michael SP are you? Which Forde are you?
Yeah, exactly. And you know, Brinsley McNamara wrote a book called The Valley of the Squinting Windows, and the squinting windows were the lace curtains and the.
Yes, yeah.
I knew a person, and I swore this was a true story. The mother obviously could have been the model for the person behind the squinting windows, because she actually kept a tally of her neighbours. Watch, so.
Who's going to
Date came out in drunk 10:45. So and so seen with another woman. All kept a tally. On her deathbed, she hands the book to her daughter.
Right.
You know, Johnny Cash, for example, was given a hymnal by his mother. You have the gift, son. Right. So he is going to be the singer, and he's going to praise God. Johnny Cash had a daughter and stepdaughters, but who does he pass the book on to? His son. You know.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of that patriarchal society in the southern states of America. But here there was a viciousness to it, that idea of the book being handed on, and these are the sins of these people.
Yes, okay, yeah.
Don't you dare forget them. And because it gives you that leverage over people. And I think that, I mean, that's an extreme example. But we do have that. People are judged not on their own talents and their own ability, or their achievements or merits. It's based on their family.
I would say, I'm only speculating here, but I would say that that's a hangover from colonialism, where you were literally defined by your birth, and you know, the firstborn son gets the farm, or the firstborn son becomes the king, or you know, and then you know, if there was Irish people, as you say, were getting notions, it's because you know the trauma of living through a part where people couldn't eat.
Yeah.
You know, and seeing somebody else, like that trauma would affect a generation, I would suggest. But
yeah, well, I would also think, you know, and again it goes back to a chat, one of the first chats I had with my late friend Michael Moloney, where, you know, not saying you look for positives in our recent troubles, but he said perhaps it made people in their heads figure out, who am I? You know, what do I stand for? You know, what are my beliefs? And you know, that it maybe did focus people's minds on, you the kind of person that you are, what you hold dear, what you hold valuable. You know, and I think he was right. You know, that you know, I'm not saying that you get into tribes and that, because that's the curse of this place. You know, whether it's football tribes or sectarian tribes or whatever. You know, but that it actually made you kind of conscious of who you were, the baggage that you carried. And you know, a lot of it is baggage. And as you know, baggage can be dropped off and just dumped. Yeah. You know?
Just leave it at the airport,
yeah. Yeah. My father was from County Down. There was people who were originally from Lissanedden, which, to those of you who haven't travelled, is between Dromore and Fintona. The Fords all worked on the railways, the GNR. And my father was reared in County Down, but he had certain expressions, like when he wanted to express his wonder at something. You know, he was a great man for going to the pictures, the great Western, Randall Scott Western. And he used to say 3 little words, and that covered, that said everything, James, that said this is the most beautiful woman that has ever walked. That's the most brilliant painting, that was the most wonderful film. It was so simple. It was boys are boys.
Boys are boys.
That says everything. Boys are boys. Boys are boys. Would you look at that? Boys are boys. So, doing the Christmas cards, I wanted to remember him, and I didn't want to be modelling. You know, it's very easy to be modelling. So I came up with this. It's a wee song called "The Shepherd's Christmas."
Lovely.
Charlie O'Kane from the hills of Crockdon was a man of few words and a master of none. He lived all alone, a shepherd by trade, and carried the crook his grandfather made, while looking his flock one cold winter's night. A star in the east seemed to sparkle so bright, and he could neither explain nor comprehend why. He just had to follow that light in the sky. He climbed over ditches and flagged across fields, belonging to Kellys, McCanns and O'Neills, to finally stop where the siren star led, to the back of Beyond and Joe Murphy's shed. Creaking open the door he tiptoed on in, and there in the darkness, making no din, silhouetted against the harrow and plough, stood a piebald donkey and wee moily cow. Trembling and twisting his cap in his hands, he knew in his heart but could not understand why he'd never forget the sight that he saw, a mother and baby asleep on the straw. From that moment on, life was never the same for that poor mountain farmer Charlie O'Kane. And when asked of the wonder of that Christmas day, "Boys, la boys," was all the old shepherd would say.